It wasn't every day you saw a wormhole station trying to shake itself apart like a cheap maraca, but today was special. Captain Jackson Vire leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold with the kind of weary annoyance usually reserved for parents witnessing kids smear cake over the walls. The station creaked ominously, groaned like it was auditioning for a horror flick. "You think it'll hold?" Miri Solis asked, not even bothering to look up from the tangle of wires in her lap. Her fingers moved with the dexterity of someone who'd long ago stopped caring about little things like safety regulations. "Oh, sure, why not?" Jackson replied. "If it doesn't, we'll all be too dead to care, so there's that." Miri snorted, a dry chuckle that echoed off the metal walls. "That optimistic outlook's why you're captain, ain't it?" Jackson just shrugged. Out here, optimism was a rare commodity, and he wasn't in the business of dealing in rare commodities. Waste of time and effort, both of which he was severely short on. The wormhole station, named in a stroke of genius or lunacy, the last best hope, was a hub for the displaced and desperate. It floated like a rust-streaked savior in the cosmic void, a safe haven for humanity's leftovers. At least that was the idea. Reality, as always, was less glamorous. Ulan Verne, the charismatic voice of the refugees, strode in with the confidence of someone who had a plan or was really good at faking one. "We've got a situation," he announced, which was about as surprising as sunrise. "What's the flavor today?" Jackson asked. "Mutiny, plague, spontaneous disassembly, worship," Ulan said deadpan. Miri finally looked up, eyebrows raised. "Worship, you mean like gods?" "Oh, the big G word," Jackson muttered. "That never ends well," Ulan nodded. "An alien entity's arrived claiming godhood. Wants the whole kneeling and praising package." "Of course it does," Miri said, rolling her eyes. "Because what else would an alien deity want? A coffee and a bagel. What does it look like?" Jackson asked, already regretting the question. "Like a bad acid trip," Ulan replied. "Glowing, shifting shape, colors that make your brain hurt." "Sounds delightful," Jackson said dryly. "And the refugees, panicking," Ulan replied. "Half of them are ready to bow, the other half are ready to bolt." Jackson rubbed his temples. "Right, because a good existential crisis was just what we needed to spice things up," Miri sighed, standing and untangling herself from the mess of wires. "Guess we're gonna go talk to the god, huh? See if it wants to chat or just smite us." "I was hoping for a nice game of cards," Jackson said, pushing off the wall. "But I suppose divine intervention takes precedence." The three of them made their way through the station, weaving through crowds of anxious refugees. The air was thick with the smell of desperation and recycled oxygen, a cocktail that would make a lesser person gag. "This reminds me of that time on Narlo 7, Miri said, sidestepping a young woman clutching a crying baby. "The one with the cult?" Jackson asked. "Yeah," Miri replied, "though I think this is worse. At least the Narlones had snacks." The docking bay was packed, a sea of faces turned toward the shimmering entity hovering in the center. It was beautiful in that terrifying, should-not-exist kind of way, like a sun made of nightmares. "All it needs is a big neon sign saying 'Worship me,'" Jackson mused. "Or 'Eat at Joe's,'" Miri added. "Either works." Ulan stepped forward, raising his hands for silence. "Attention," he called, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "We need to handle this calmly." "Calmly," someone shouted back. "It's a flipping god, or a really bored alien with too much time on its hands," Miri muttered. Jackson cleared his throat, stepping up next to Ulan. "Look, we don't know what it wants yet. Maybe it's here to offer us a multidimensional timeshare." There was a ripple of nervous laughter, the kind that spoke of people desperate for anything resembling hope. The entity pulsed, its colors flickering like a cosmic disco ball. A voice echoed through the bay, deep and resonant, like 1,000 voices speaking as one. "Kneel before me," it commanded, the words vibrating in the bones of everyone present. "Wow, straight to the point," Miri said. "No dinner, no drinks, just kneel or else, classy." Jackson raised an eyebrow at the entity. "And if we don't," the entity's colors darkened, swirling into angry reds and purples, "then you shall face my wrath." Ah, wrath, Jackson said with a nod. Always with the wrath. Can't we just buy you a nice fruit basket instead? Ulan shot Jackson a look that screamed shut up, but the captain merely shrugged. I'm just saying maybe diplomacy isn't dead yet. You dare mock me, the entity boomed, its voice shaking the very floor. Kind of my thing, Jackson replied casually. Alien God Station Command, my own reflection on bad hair days. The entity surged, its form expanding, and the crowd took an instinctive step back. Okay, Miri said, hands raised in a placating gesture. Let's all just relax, we don't want any. Smiting. Jackson leaned in toward Ulan, whispering, got any ideas, or are we just winging it? Winging it, Ulan replied tightly. Fantastic, Jackson said. Just like old times. The entity loomed ominously, a swirling mass of light and menace. I demand obedience, it intoned. And I demand a decent cup of coffee, Jackson shot back. But I guess we can't always get what we want, can we? Miri groaned. Jax, you're gonna get us all killed. Oh, come on, Jackson retorted. If it's really a god, it'll have a sense of humor. Right? The entity remained silent, its form shifting like a disturbed oil slick. Ulan cleared his throat, stepping forward with a placating smile. Surely there's something we can offer in exchange for your benevolence. The entity considered this, its form quivering. Your devotion, it said finally. Your unwavering allegiance. Well, we can certainly offer sarcasm, Miri muttered. And coffee, Jackson added. Ulan shot them both a look that could have melted Durasteel. Please, we're trying to negotiate here. Right, Jackson said. So, devotion, how about we start with a nice song? Everyone loves a good hymn or two, right? The entity paused, its luminescence dimming slightly. Music, it said slowly. An offering of music, Jackson grinned. There we go, something we can work with. Miri shot him a skeptical look. You know any good hymns? Jackson shrugged. Just one goes something like, oh, won't you stay another day? You're quoting old Earth pop, Miri said deadpan. Hey, it could work, Jackson replied. The entity seemed to consider this, its form flickering uncertainly. Sing, it commanded. Jackson looked around at the sea of nervous faces. Well, you heard the god. Anyone know the words? A few voices tentatively started, others quickly joining in, forming a shaky chorus that filled the bay. It was off-key, awkward, and possibly offensive to any music-loving deities, but it was something. We really should have picked a better song, Miri said, wincing at a particularly sour note. Too late now, Jackson replied, keeping his eyes on the entity. Just hope it doesn't hate pop music as much as I do. As the last notes faded, the entity hovered there, silent and inscrutable. The crowd waited with bated breath, tension thick enough to cut with a plasma torch. Finally, the entity spoke, its voice softer, less menacing. Your offering is acceptable. Well, thank the stars, Jackson said, exhaling loudly. I knew our singing was divine. You're just lucky it didn't decide to smite us out of sheer musical disgust, Miri muttered. The entity's form began to shrink, its colors calming, shifting to a gentle blue. You have appeased me for now, it said. But remember, your devotion must remain unwavering. Sure, Jackson said, waving a hand dismissively. Unwavering devotion. Got it. With one last pulse of light, the entity vanished, leaving behind a crowd that was equal parts relieved and bewildered. Well, Ulan said, turning to the others. That went better than expected. Better than expected is the new baseline for success around here, Jackson replied, grinning. I'll take it. Miri shook her head, a rueful smile on her lips. Next time, let's try not to piss off a cosmic deity, yeah, Jackson shrugged. Where's the fun in that? The crowd began to disperse, murmurs of disbelief and relief rippling through the bay. The threat was gone, at least for now, and life on the station would continue its chaotic, unpredictable course. As they made their way back through the ship, Jackson couldn't help but chuckle. You know, he said, this might just be the weirdest day I've ever had, Miri snorted. Give it time, Jax, it's a big universe. Yeah, Jackson agreed. And I'm sure it's full of even more gods who need a good laugh. They walked on, burdened by the knowledge that tomorrow might bring new challenges, but also strangely buoyed by the absurdity of it all. Jackson Vire leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, surveying the motley crew assembled in the station's grimy mess hall. The place was a testament to bad decisions and worse architecture, a maze of flickering lights and peeling paint that felt as if it might collapse at any moment. An optimistic name for a place that was anything but. "All right, you lot," Jackson called out, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "We've got a situation, again. Are you surprised? I'm not." Miri Solis was sitting on a counter, her feet swinging back and forth, one hand tangled in a mess of wires. "It's like the universe hates us, or at least finds us mildly annoying," she quipped. "Alien gods showing up out of nowhere demanding a fan club. Not exactly what I signed up for." "You signed up?" Jackson raised an eyebrow. "I thought you just wandered in here by accident." "More like a tragic miscalculation," Miri replied. She pulled a face as a spark flew from one of the wires. "And speaking of miscalculations, the entire station's been glitching like an old Earth video game since our divine guest arrived." Ulan Verne leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, a picture of manufactured confidence. "What do you mean by glitching?" he asked. Miri gestured vaguely around. "Oh, you know, life support systems deciding to take impromptu breaks, the lights flickering like it's a cheap horror film, and the waste recyclers refusing to do their one job. Nothing major." "Ah, the joys of space travel," Jackson said dryly, "where everything kills you slowly instead of all at once." Ulan frowned, his brow furrowing. "Are you saying this is the aliens' doing?" "Of course it is," Miri replied, rolling her eyes. "Only a cosmic god would have the pettiness to start a malfunction marathon as a flex. Look, all I'm saying is that if it's going to smite us, I'd prefer it do so without turning off the air first," Jackson said, brushing dust from his sleeve. "I like breathing." "Breathing's overrated," Miri said, smirking. "But since we're on the topic, I've been monitoring the systems. There's definitely something manipulating the station's controls. It's subtle but persistent, like a bad itch you can't scratch." Jackson let out a long-suffering sigh. "Great. So not only do we have to worry about becoming cosmic roadkill, but our own station's turned against us." "Life's a peach, huh?" Miri shot back. Ulan stepped forward, adopting his best leadership pose, which was mostly just standing slightly taller and looking serious. "We need to address this before it spirals out of control," he said. "The refugees are already on edge." "On edge. They are about ready to form an orderly queue for the nearest airlock," Jackson muttered. "Can't say I blame them." Ulan ignored the comment, continuing with his impromptu pep talk. "We need to keep people calm, show them we're in control even if we're not." "Smoke and mirrors," Miri said. "Classic move." "Hey, if it works for politicians, why not us?" Jackson shrugged. "So, what's the plan, fearless leader?" Ulan hesitated for a moment, his confidence cracking just a little. "We convene a meeting," he said, voice firm. "Explain the situation, reinforce the idea that we're working on a solution." Translation: "Pretend we know what we're doing and hope no one calls our bluff," Miri said. "Exactly," Ulan replied, unabashed. Jackson shook his head, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "I love a good bluff. Keeps life interesting." They spent the next hour rounding up the station's assorted denizens, herding them into the central meeting room, a wide space lined with beat-up chairs and old screens that flickered like dying stars. The room was filled with a tense buzz, the kind that precedes either a full-blown riot or a really disappointing announcement. Jackson stood in front of the crowd, trying to look more authoritative than he felt. "All right, everyone, settle down," he called. "We've got a bit of a situation, as I'm sure you've noticed. The alien deity that's decided to grace us with its presence is causing a few technical difficulties." "Technical difficulties," someone shouted from the back. "The waste recyclers are spewing back what we put in." "Lovely," Jackson muttered under his breath. "Look, we're handling it. Miri's got her hands in the guts of the station and is seeing what she can do." Miri raised a hand, fingers stained with oil, giving a mock salute. Just your friendly neighborhood engineer trying not to blow us all up. Comforting, Jackson said. Anyway, we're working on it. In the meantime, don't panic. That's reassuring. Another voice piped up, dripping with sarcasm. Hey, I'm just as terrified as the rest of you, Jackson replied. But panicking won't help, unless you're into that sort of thing, in which case, by all means, carry on. Ulan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. We need to remember that we're all in this together. We have to stay unified, act as one. Yeah, because nothing says unity like being forced to worship a glow stick, Miri muttered, adjusting a loose wire. The crowd shifted uneasily, whispers spreading like wildfire as people processed the information. Jackson watched them, feeling the weight of leadership pressing down like a reluctant cat. Look, he said, raising his voice to cut through the murmur. We don't have all the answers yet, but we're working on it. Just bear with us and try not to do anything stupid, all right? Because stupidity's our job, Miri added, grinning. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, Ulan turned to Jackson and Miri. We'll need to find a way to communicate with this entity, he said, voice low. Figure out what it really wants. Didn't it make that pretty clear? Miri asked. Kneel, worship, don't piss me off. Yeah, but there might be more to it, Ulan replied. Something we can use, Jackson nodded. Information's the key. Maybe we can appeal to its vanity. Gods tend to have that in spades. Or we could bribe it with a mixtape, Miri suggested. Worked the first time. Let's keep that one in our back pocket, Jackson said. For now, let's focus on surviving until tomorrow. The station shuddered as if to punctuate his sentence, a low groan reverberating through the walls. Jackson took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. All right, let's get to work, he said. We've got a god to placate and a station to keep from falling apart. As they headed back to the control room, Miri glanced over at Jackson. You ever think about retiring? Finding a nice quiet planet where nothing wants to kill us? Every day, Jackson replied. But where's the fun in that? They entered the control room, a cramped space crammed with outdated equipment and flickering monitors. Miri immediately set to work, fingers dancing over the console, trying to coax some semblance of cooperation from the station's systems. Jackson watched her work, feeling a flicker of admiration for her stubborn determination. Any luck? He asked. Depends on your definition of luck, Miri replied, not looking up. I've got a few ideas, but it's like trying to fix a sinking ship with duct tape and good intentions. Sounds promising, Jackson said. Miri grinned. Don't worry. I'm too stubborn to let some cosmic entity get the better of me. As she continued her work, Jackson turned to Ulan, who was watching the monitors with a focused intensity. Think we can talk our way out of this one? Jackson asked. Ulan shrugged. Talking's always an option. Making the other side listen is the trick. Jackson nodded, appreciating the sentiment. Then let's start talking. Maybe we can convince it that we're more trouble than we're worth. Now that's a sales pitch I can get behind, Miri said, a hint of amusement in her voice. The hours slipped by in a blur of frenzied activity and rising tension. Miri worked tirelessly, wrestling with the station's systems while Jackson and Ulan tried to find a way to communicate with the entity that loomed over their heads like a cosmic sword of Damocles. Finally, as the artificial lights dimmed to mimic night, Miri leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. All right, I've managed to stabilize most of the systems, she said, but it's a temporary fix. We need a more permanent solution, which means dealing with our celestial guest, Ulan said, a determined glint in his eye. Jackson nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders once more. Let's hope it likes our brand of diplomacy, he said, or at least has a sense of humor, Miri added. Guess we'll find out, Jackson said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty lurking beneath. Let's get some rest. Tomorrow we take on a god. As they left the control room, the station groaned again, a reminder of the precarious situation they faced. But despite the looming threat, Jackson felt a flicker of hope. They had survived the day, and with any luck they'd figure out a way to survive the next. In the cold, unforgiving vacuum of space, Hope was a rare commodity, but for the crew of the Last Best Hope, it was enough to keep them fighting. And if they had to face down a god with nothing but their wits and a few sarcastic quips, so be it. After all, it wouldn't be the first time. The Last Best Hope was a name that got crueler by the hour. The station shuddered like an old drunk, and the life support systems were flirting with the idea of taking a permanent vacation. Jackson Vire had just about had it with cosmic deities and their penchant for making life difficult. He was in the mess hall, where the aroma of something that was once food failed to mask the metallic stench of desperation. Ulan Verne was pacing like a caged animal, his manufactured confidence showing cracks wider than the station's hull. Miri Solis had her head buried in a tangle of wires, a look of concentration etched into her face as she tried to wrestle back control from their unwelcome guest. Jackson slouched against the bulkhead with a sigh. You know, I always thought dying in space would be quick. Like one hole in the hull and poof, out you go. This is just cruel. Quit whining, Miri called, not bothering to look up. At least dying slowly gives you time to regret all your life choices. Reassuring as ever, Miri. Jackson smirked, though the humor didn't quite reach his eyes. What's the status on our air supply? Or is breathing about to become a luxury? Miri wiped grease from her forehead, leaving a streak of grime in its place. Life support's on its last legs, but I'm working on it. Just need to convince the station it doesn't actually want us dead. Wouldn't that be a first? Ulan muttered, stopping his pacing long enough to give Jackson a look. Any word from our divine overlord? Not unless you count the ominous silence as a message, Jackson replied, which, given our luck, is probably just as bad as anything it could say. Ulan nodded grimly. I tried reaching out again, but the thing's more stubborn than a tax collector. Doesn't seem interested in small talk. Shocking, Miri quipped, untangling a particularly stubborn knot of cables. Have you tried asking it for its favorite color, or maybe what it does for fun when it's not tormenting hapless spacefarers? Next on the list, Ulan said dryly. Right after I offer it a cup of tea and a biscuit. Jackson chuckled despite himself. Maybe it's one of those types that just wants to hear itself talk. We could nod politely and pretend to hang on its every word. Whatever works, Miri said, her focus returning to the mess of wires. In the meantime, I've got a plan. I like plans, Jackson said. They're almost as good as hope. What have you got? Thinking of using some old tech to counteract whatever alien magic's messing with us, Miri explained, her fingers dancing over the console with the precision of a surgeon. Flipping the station's systems to analog. It's risky, but it might limit the aliens' influence. Ulan raised an eyebrow. Analog, as in relying on ancient tech that we'd need to wind up with a key, Miri shrugged. Desperate times, desperate measures. Besides, sometimes the old ways can still kick new tech in the teeth. Sounds like a long shot, Jackson said. It's the only shot we've got, Miri countered. Unless you fancy putting on a show for our divine audience. Not my first choice, Jackson admitted. But hell, let's give it a go. Worst case, we blow the place up. Ulan winced. Can't say that fills me with confidence. Think of it as a learning experience, Jackson suggested. Either we fix things or we learn what not to do next time we deal with an almighty being. Next time, Ulan asked incredulously. You planning on doing this again? Jackson shrugged. Depends how much I enjoy the company. Miri rolled her eyes and kept working. Let's just focus on not dying first, all right? Plenty of time to joke about our miserable luck later. The station gave another ominous groan, a not-so-subtle reminder of their precarious situation. Jackson could see the strain on Ulan's face, the flicker of doubt creeping in. The man wanted to be a leader, but leadership was a tricky beast, one that didn't always follow orders. We need to buy you time, Miri, Jackson said, deciding to take charge. If this plan's gonna work, we need every second we can get. Ulan nodded, a fresh resolve settling over him. I'll keep trying to negotiate. Maybe I can bore it into listening. That's the spirit, Jackson said, clapping Ulan on the shoulder. Who knew that all those hours of ear-splitting diplomatic lectures would come in handy someday? Always knew they'd be worth the headache, Ulan replied, though his voice was a touch too strained to sell the joke. Miri snorted. Okay, enough with the love fest. I need to concentrate and your bromance is distracting. Jackson raised his hands in surrender. All right. I'll leave you to your magic. Just yell if you need anything blown up. Will do, Miri said, diving back into her work. With a nod to Ulan, Jackson left the mess hall, making his way to the communications hub where he tried to reason with a god. The corridors were dim and unwelcoming, the station reminding him of its age and the toll time and neglect had taken. The hub was a claustrophobic room lined with outdated equipment and blinking lights. Jackson took a seat at the main console, fingers hovering over the buttons as he considered his strategy. Talking to a god wasn't exactly a skill he'd honed, but improvisation was a universal talent. All right, you cosmic pain in the ass, he muttered under his breath. Time to see if you've got an itch for conversation. He flicked a few switches, routing the station's communication system to broadcast on every frequency he could manage. He had no idea if the alien would hear or even care, but he was determined to give it a shot. This is Jackson Vire of the Last Best Hope, broadcasting to our not-so-friendly neighborhood deity, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. We'd really appreciate it if you'd stop making our lives hell, or at least tell us what the hell you want. Silence greeted his plea, the low hum of the station's systems the only response. Jackson leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling and feeling more than a little foolish. Guess gods don't do customer service, he grumbled. Jackson was about to shut down the broadcast when the console crackled to life. The sound was static at first, then a voice broke through, deep and resonant. Why do you resist? It asked, the words echoing with an otherworldly timbre that sent chills down Jackson's spine. Your fate is sealed. Accept your place as servants. Jackson swallowed hard, forcing himself to respond. We're not really the servant type, he said. More of the fiercely independent spacefarers, you know. Got a thing for freedom. Freedom is an illusion, the voice replied, its tone impassive. Serve and prosper or resist and perish. Jackson clenched his jaw, pushing down the surge of anger rising within him. Look, we're just trying to survive out here. If you want to play God, there are plenty of other stations. Your defiance amuses us, the voice said, a hint of something, was it amusement, creeping into its tone. But it is futile. Yeah, well, we're a stubborn bunch, Jackson said, a defiant edge to his voice. You picked the wrong ragtag crew to mess with. The line went dead, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts and the persistent hum of the station. He let out a long breath, feeling the weight of their predicament pressing down on him. Back in the control room, Miri was making progress. She'd managed to isolate some of the station's core systems, stabilizing them enough to prevent a complete meltdown. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it bought them time, precious minutes they couldn't afford to waste. Ulan returned, a weary determination etched onto his face. Any luck? He asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Jackson shook his head. The thing likes to talk, but it's not exactly open to negotiation. Keeps going on about our fate being sealed. Figures, Ulan muttered. Gods never are much for compromise. We'll just have to make it see things our way, Jackson said, his tone grim but resolute. Miri glanced up from her work, a hint of hope in her eyes. If I can get the analog systems up and running, we might have a fighting chance. It'll be like fighting a wildfire with a squirt gun, but at least we won't be sitting ducks. That's the spirit, Jackson said, a flicker of admiration for her tenacity. Let's show this cosmic bully what humanity's made of. The Iors wore on, the crew working tirelessly to hold the station together. Tensions were high, but there was a shared determination that kept them going. In the face of insurmountable odds, they refused to back down. The station continued to groan and shudder, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. But as Jackson watched Miri work and listened to Ulan's steady resolve, he felt a flicker of hope, a stubborn, irrational belief that they might just make it through this. They were battered and bruised, A motley crew facing down a god with nothing but their wits and a few outdated systems. But in the cold depths of space, it was enough. As the artificial lights dimmed to mimic night, Jackson allowed himself a moment of reflection. They'd survived another day, and with any luck, they'd keep surviving. Tomorrow, they'd face the god again, armed with their makeshift solutions and the indomitable spirit that defined humanity. In the end, maybe that would be enough to tip the scales. And if not, well, they'd go down fighting, and they'd make damn sure the universe remembered their name. Jackson leaned against the bulkhead, trying to ignore the thin veneer of grime that lined every surface of the station. He watched the trickle of humanity that remained aboard the last best hope shuffle about their daily routines, their expressions a blend of exhaustion and despair. It was a miracle they'd stuck around this long. Then again, when your choices were limited to this crumbling station or the vacuum of space, miracle was too generous a term. More like lack of options. Ulan stood nearby, his brows furrowed in concentration as he attempted to engage a particularly disgruntled group congregating in the corner of the mess hall. It was a ragtag bunch, engineers, former spacefarers, and a couple of opportunistic merchants who had the misfortune of seeking refuge here right when everything went to hell. "We're in a pickle," Ulan declared, his tone filled with the kind of faux confidence that every bad leader fancies is real. "The situation's grim, but we're not beaten, but pretty damn bruised," a voice piped up from the crowd. It belonged to Rayner, a grizzled engineer with a beard that looked like it was plotting an escape of its own. "Exactly," Ulan replied, clinging to Rayner's words like a drowning man to flotsam. "We've got brains, guts, and the tenacity to see this through, or we just kneel and kiss the god's proverbial ass," Rayner added, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe salvation comes with a side of humility." Jackson winced. That was the crux of it, wasn't it? With an alien entity breathing down their necks, some of the crew were beginning to wonder if it might be easier to just swear fealty and hope the deity wasn't the smiting type. "You think groveling's gonna get us anywhere?" Jackson asked, stepping into the fray. "Last I checked, gods weren't big on mercy. Especially cosmic ones with inferiority complexes." "Maybe not," Rayner admitted, "but it beats suffocating when the life support finally gives up and we're left choking on our own CO2. "We're not there yet," Ulan interjected, trying to sound hopeful. It didn't suit him. "Miri's working on it. Miri's always working on it," Rayner shot back. "And we're all grateful, but even miracles have an expiry date." Jackson could sense the growing despair. It was like a slow leak in the airlock, steady and insidious. Fortunately, Miri had a way of making the impossible seem plausible, even if she did it with a scowl and a healthy dose of sarcasm. "Speaking of miracles," Jackson said, hoping to redirect the conversation, "Miri's got a prototype." "Something that might give us a fighting chance," Rayner grunted. "You mean the analog thing she mentioned?" "Heard it's more likely to blow us to kingdom come than save us." "Details," Jackson replied with a dismissive wave. "I'm sure explosions are part of her process." Ulan stepped forward, determination in his eyes. "We need to trust Miri and give it a shot," he urged. "We've come too far to give up now." Rayner sighed, scratching his beard thoughtfully. "Just wish we had more than hope and a prayer." "Prayers aren't exactly our strong suit," Jackson quipped. "Let's stick with the plan and leave the praying to those with a death wish." Meanwhile, in the depths of the station's bowels, Miri was knee-deep in technology that had been outdated before she was born. The analog systems were a nightmare of wires and switches, like a game of hide-and-seek with a particularly sadistic child. But she was making progress, and that was more than she could say for most days. "Hey Miri," Jackson greeted as he entered the cramped workshop. The air was thick with the smell of solder and desperation. "Jackson," she replied without looking up from her work. "Come to check on the crazy lady and her ticking time bomb. You know I love watching you work your magic," he said, leaning against a nearby console, careful not to touch anything. "How's it going?" "Terribly, thanks for asking," Miri answered, a hint of frustration in her voice. But at least I haven't set anything on fire. Yet, always a silver lining, Jackson remarked, trying to sound encouraging. What's the latest? Miri sighed, placing her tools down and rubbing her temples. I've managed to isolate a few systems. If I can get the analog systems to override the digital ones, we might be able to keep the life support stable. But it's a big if. And if it doesn't work, then we're screwed in the most spectacular way imaginable, Miri said, flashing him a grim smile. But at least we'll go out with a bang. Jackson chuckled, despite the gravity of the situation. Well, that's something, yeah, but I'm not a fan of fireworks when I'm the one holding the stick of dynamite, Miri replied. I'd rather stay in one piece, thanks. Jackson nodded, appreciating her honesty. We've got a few folks considering throwing their lot in with the god. Think it's a viable option. Last time I checked, gods weren't offering favorable employee contracts, Miri snorted. But if they're desperate enough to try, who am I to stop them? I think they want a guarantee that doesn't involve suffocation or divine wrath, Jackson said. Then they're in the wrong line of work, Miri replied, turning back to her project. Tell them to hold tight. If this works, they won't have to grovel anytime soon. Keep us posted, Jackson said, giving her a quick nod of appreciation. We're counting on you. Yeah, no pressure or anything, Miri muttered as Jackson made his way out, leaving her to the tangled mess of wires and circuits. Back in the mess hall, the tension was palpable. The promise of salvation, however faint, was enough to keep the crew from outright rebellion, but it was a tenuous piece at best. Ulan stood at the center of the room, trying to keep spirits high. We're on the verge of a breakthrough, he claimed, his voice rising above the murmurs. Miri's got something up her sleeve that could turn the tide, or blow us to kingdom come, Raynor interjected, folding his arms across his chest. Jackson, Ulan called out, spotting him at the entrance. Can you speak to the risk? Jackson met the eyes of the crew. Risk? Sure, there's a risk, he admitted. But isn't there always? We live on a hunk of metal held together by duct tape and wishful thinking. What's one more gamble? That's not exactly comforting, a voice piped up from the back. Wasn't meant to be, Jackson replied with a shrug, but it's the truth. We're out here flying by the seat of our pants. Might as well make it count. A ripple of laughter followed his words, albeit bitter and short-lived. It was something, at least, a spark of the irreverent defiance that had kept them going this long. Besides, Jackson added, what's the fun of surviving if we do it the boring way? The crowd began to disperse, the tension easing slightly as people returned to their tasks, albeit with an undercurrent of anxiety that refused to dissipate. Ulan approached Jackson, a weary look in his eyes. You think we have a shot? He asked quietly. Jackson considered the question, then nodded. We've got Miri and a crew that's too stubborn to quit. If anyone can pull it off, it's us. Ulan gave him a thin smile. Let's hope you're right. As the makeshift family aboard the Last Best Hope hunkered down for another night on the edge of oblivion, the sense of camaraderie was fragile, yet unyielding. They were a mismatched group of survivors, held together by spit, string, and the grim determination to see another sunrise, if only to flip off the god that hovered in the void. Even as the station groaned and rattled like an old beast on its last legs, there was a shared sense of purpose, a knowledge that they were facing the storm together, whether they wanted to or not. In the dim glow of the mess hall, Jackson found himself staring out into the inky blackness beyond the viewport. He wondered if the god was watching, if it found amusement in their plight, or if it even cared. Hey, you, Miri's voice cut through his reverie as she joined him, her expression a mix of exasperation and determination. I've got something for you. Jackson turned, his curiosity piqued. What's that? Hope, Miri replied, her lips curling into a wry smile, or at least the closest thing to it. Jackson chuckled, feeling a flicker of warmth in his chest. I'll take it. We could use a little miracle right about now. Don't get your hopes up, she warned, though her eyes sparkled with defiance. We're not out of the woods yet, Woods, Jackson teased. Didn't know we had those in space, Miri rolled her eyes, but there was affection in the gesture. "You know what I mean. Now get some rest. We've got a long day ahead." Jackson nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over him. As he made his way to his bunk, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they'd pull through this after all. The station was a ticking time bomb, the crew a ragtag bunch of misfits, and the universe a cruel and uncaring place. But in the midst of it all they had each other, and sometimes that was enough. As the lights flickered and dimmed, Jackson closed his eyes and let himself drift into the uneasy embrace of sleep, hoping that tomorrow would bring a new dawn, and with it, the promise of survival in the face of the impossible. The last best hope was, as usual, teetering on the brink of collapse. It had all the stability of a house of cards in a hurricane, and the residents had all the optimism of a cat in a bathtub. The station's mess hall, dimly lit and reeking of stale desperation, was buzzing with the kind of nervous energy that usually precedes either a breakthrough or a breakdown. Jackson Vire found himself at the center of this human maelstrom, his usual spot when things went wrong, so always. "All right, folks, let's keep it together," he barked, trying to sound like he had his act together. "We've got enough problems without adding mob justice to the list." "Yeah," Rayner, the grizzled engineer who looked like he'd been carved out of the backside of an asteroid, snorted. "You mean besides the fact that we're one solar fart away from being space debris?" "Exactly," Jackson replied dryly. "Let's not tempt the universe. It's got a pretty sick sense of humor." Ulan Verne, pacing like a hyperactive squirrel on caffeine, wasn't helping matters. "We need to stay focused. Miri's working on a fix." "And yeah, we've heard it all before," interrupted a voice from the back, its owner hidden behind a veil of shadows and even darker cynicism. "It's been fix this, fix that since they installed the first bulkhead. Would you prefer we just roll over and let the gods have their way?" Ulan snapped, trying to sound authoritative but mostly just sounding like a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Jackson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Look, Miri's got a plan." "It's a long shot, but hell, aren't they all?" As if on cue, Miri solely stormed in, covered in what appeared to be a combination of motor oil and existential dread. "Good news," she announced, her voice laced with sarcasm so thick you could choke on it. "The analog override is ready for a test." "And the bad news?" Rayner asked, voice dripping with the kind of resignation that only comes from years of misplaced hope. "The bad news is that it's ready for a test," Miri replied, rolling her eyes. "And if it fails, we'll be the first ones to know. Well, second if you count our alien overlords." A murmur rippled through the room, half anticipation, half abject terror. There's nothing quite like the impending doom of potentially explosive technology to remind people of their mortality. "All right," Jackson said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get this show on the road. If we're gonna blow up, let's do it with style." The control room was a cramped, claustrophobic affair, full of blinking lights and incomprehensible readouts that looked more like a toddler's finger painting than anything useful. Miri was at the helm, furiously flipping switches and muttering curses that would make a sailor blush. "Okay, everyone," she began, addressing the small group of hopefuls and skeptics, "I'm about to engage the analog override. If you're religious, now's a good time to start praying. If you're not, well, pretend." Jackson stood beside her, trying his best to look confident despite the gnawing pit of anxiety in his stomach. "You know," he said, leaning in, "I thought you were supposed to be the miracle worker." Miri shot him a look that could fry an egg. "Miracles are just a fancy way of saying I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but I'm damn well trying." "Comforting," Jackson replied, not comforted in the least. "Okay," Miri muttered more to herself than anyone else, "here goes nothing." She flipped the final switch, and for a moment nothing happened. The kind of nothing that's heavy with the weight of anticipation. Then, the control room lights flickered, the hum of machinery reached a fever pitch, and somewhere beneath their feet, something went clunk in a way that was definitely not reassuring. "Well, that didn't sound good," Rayner commented, folding his arms as he leaned against a bulkhead that probably needed as much support as he did. The room held its collective breath as Miri stared at the panels, fingers poised over the controls like she could will them into compliance. "Come on, you piece of junk," she murmured, coaxing it like a stubborn child. But her child wasn't listening. Just when it seemed like they might have pulled off the impossible, the station gave a violent shudder, followed by the unmistakable sound of systems failing en masse. The overhead lights dimmed to an ominous glow, and a loud klaxon began its shrill song of impending doom. "Oh, that's never good," Jackson said, his voice almost lost amid the wailing alarms. "Miri." Ulan's voice crackled over a nearby intercom, fraught with barely contained panic. "What's happening?" "Well, Ulan, if you're in the mood for a spectacular disaster, you're in luck," Miri replied, furiously trying to regain control. "It turns out the universe hates us today." "No kidding," Raynor muttered, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the console. "We need to get this under control before the whole damn station decides to take a vacation into the void." Miri was already on it, fingers flying across the panel, sweat beading on her brow. "The analog systems are rejecting the override. It's like trying to teach an old dog new tricks when the dog's decided it hates tricks." "Well, keep teaching," Jackson urged, trying to sound encouraging but mostly sounding desperate. "Before the dog bites us." Back in the mess hall, the atmosphere had shifted from nervous anticipation to outright chaos. Ulan tried to keep order, but it was like trying to herd cats that were on fire and armed with explosives. "We need to stick together." Ulan shouted over the din, though his voice was losing the battle against the rising tide of panic. "They are here," a voice said, cutting through the chaos like a knife. "The gods are here. We should join them." It was Margot, a woman with the kind of fervent desperation that made her dangerous. She'd always been a bit too eager to embrace the cosmic unknown, and now her eyes blazed with the zeal of the converted. Jackson barged into the mess hall just in time to hear her proclamation. "Throwing in with the gods, are we?" he drawled, leaning against a table like he had all the time in the world. "Last I checked, they weren't hiring. Better to be on their side than become cosmic roadkill," Margot shot back, her voice filled with conviction that bordered on madness. "And what makes you think they'll treat you any better than the rest of us?" Jackson challenged, the question hanging heavy in the air like an asteroid on a collision course. Margot paused, the fire in her eyes flickering. "Because they are offering salvation, or a slower death," Jackson countered, his voice hard as diamond. "We don't know what their endgame is, and I'm not about to gamble with what little we have left." The room was silent, tension stretched taut as a wire. The crew's eyes darted between Margot and Jackson, caught in the gravity of their standoff. "Look," Jackson said, softening his tone just a fraction, "I get it. We're scared and we're out of options. But we can't just hand over what's left of our humanity because things got tough. We've faced worse, have we?" Margot asked, her conviction wavering. "Yes," Jackson replied firmly. "And we're still here, aren't we?" For a moment, the weight of his words settled over the room, an anchor in the storm. Then slowly, heads began to nod. Whatever else they were survivors. "All right," Ulan said, stepping forward to regain control of the situation. "Let's get back to work. We need all hands on deck if we're going to pull through this." The crew dispersed, some muttering darkly about the futility of it all, others clinging to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd see another sunrise. Back in the control room, Miri was still locked in a battle of wits with the station's analog systems. It was a fight she seemed to be losing. "Come on, you stubborn piece of junk," she growled, smacking the console with the flat of her hand. "I don't have time for this." Jackson entered, carrying with him the lingering tension from the mess hall. "How's it looking?" "Like I'm trying to teach a fish to ride a bicycle," Miri replied, not bothering to look up. "Sounds productive," Jackson said, crossing his arms. "Any chance of a miracle?" "Doesn't look like it," she admitted, her voice weary. "But I've got a few more tricks up my sleeve. Do they involve explosions?" Jackson asked, half joking, half serious. Only if I'm lucky, Miri quipped. As they worked, the station continued to groan and creak, each sound a reminder that their time was running out. The god's presence hung over them like a storm cloud, and the threat of capitulation loomed large in everyone's mind. Jackson, Miri said after a while, her voice low, "What if we can't fix this?" Jackson paused, considering the weight of her question. "Then we go down swinging," he said finally. "Because if there's one thing I know, it's that we don't give up." "Not now, not ever," Miri nodded, a flicker of determination igniting in her gaze. "Then let's get to work." In the face of impossible odds, with the gods at their doorstep and the universe seemingly set against them, the crew of the Last Best Hope did what they always did. They fought back with sarcasm and grit, refusing to bow to the whims of fate. And as the station continued its slow, creaking dance with destruction, the resolve of its inhabitants burned bright, a defiant flame against the encroaching darkness. In the dimly lit control room, Miri Solis wrestled with the station's analog systems like a gambler with everything to lose. Sweat trickled down her temple as she slammed the console repeatedly, half expecting a mechanical deity to pop out and offer some divine intervention. But space was about as generous as a miserly uncle at Thanksgiving. Jackson Vire stood by her, doing his best impression of someone vaguely competent. "You got anything, Miri?" "Because I'm fresh out of ideas and the gods aren't exactly sending invites to their next soiree." Miri glanced up, her expression a mix of exhaustion and irritation. "You know, I think I've found something. Call it a hunch, or maybe a desperate hope. Turns out our celestial squatters aren't as invincible as they think. That's so, yeah," she grunted, turning back to the panel. "I've been sifting through the mess they've made of our systems. They're smart but also sloppy. There's a signal, a weak point in their tech, a backdoor they didn't bother to lock." Jackson raised an eyebrow, a smile flickering at the corners of his mouth. "So you're saying the gods left a key under the mat, more like they left the door ajar and forgot to send us a do not disturb sign," she replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "If we can exploit this, we might have a fighting chance." Across the station, Ulan Vern was trying to put out metaphorical fires with the same finesse a pigeon might exhibit when trying to solve a Rubik's Cube. The mess hall was a cacophony of fear and frustration, and Ulan's attempts to inspire were falling on ears more jaded than a rock star on a farewell tour. "All right, everyone," Ulan shouted with the kind of faux confidence that could have sold sand to an android. "Listen up, we've got a plan." "Well, more of a vague outline, but it's better than the nothing we had before." A skeptical voice rose from the back. "And what makes you think this will work? We're up against gods, man." Ulan cleared his throat. "Look, I get it. You're scared. I'm scared. Hell, even the rats are packing their bags. But here's the thing, humans have been screwing up and surviving for centuries. This is just another Tuesday. We improvise, adapt, and occasionally we succeed." The crew's grumblings dulled to a low murmur as Ulan continued, warming up to his own brand of motivational speaking. "Remember the great solar split? We made it through that. And when the Earth decided it was time for a bath without us, what did we do? We found a new home, even if it is a floating tin can at the edge of the universe. We're stubborn, resourceful, and just crazy enough to think we can win." A smattering of reluctant chuckles rippled through the crowd. Nothing like gallows humor to unite the damned. Back in the control room, Miri was knee-deep in digital entrails, unraveling the intricate mess left behind by their not-so-benevolent deities. "Okay, here's the deal," she announced, drawing Jackson's attention. "We hit them where it hurts, right in their hubris. Their tech relies on a central node. We overload it, they go blind. You sure about that?" Jackson asked, his faith in miracles slightly less than his faith in the station's waste recyclers. "Sure as I am that coffee tastes like regret," Miri replied. "It's risky, but it's our best shot." Jackson nodded. "All right, let's inform the others. If we're going down, might as well take him with us." The pair made their way to the mess hall, where Ulan was still doing his best to rally the troops. As they entered, Miri caught the tail end of Ulan's speech. So what do you say, folks? Are we gonna roll over and let them use us as cosmic compost, or are we gonna show them what humans are made of? Jackson cleared his throat loudly, drawing all eyes to him. Sorry to interrupt your pep talk, Ulan, but we've got news. Miri's found a weak spot in the aliens' tech. It's not a guarantee, but it's the first good news we've had since the coffee machine broke. Miri stepped forward, her voice firm. We need to hit their central node. Overload it, and they might be too busy dealing with the fallout to bother with us. A ripple of cautious optimism spread through the room. Even Margot, who had been teetering on the brink of divine allegiance, looked intrigued. But what if it doesn't work? She asked, skepticism still coloring her tone. Then we'll know for sure that we're doomed, Jackson replied, his words laced with dry humor. But at least we'll go out with a bang rather than a whimper. Ulan clapped a hand on Jackson's shoulder, his energy buoyed by the prospect of action. Sounds like a plan. Let's gear up and give the gods a run for their money. As the crew began to mobilize, a sense of purpose ignited within them, a spark of rebellion against the divine tyranny that had invaded their lives. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind them that they were, after all, human, and humans didn't surrender. Preparations went about as smoothly as you'd expect in a station held together by duct tape and denial. The crew scrounged for makeshift weapons, cobbling together an arsenal that might have been laughable in better circumstances, but now seemed like the tools of salvation. Miri worked alongside Rayner, the grizzled engineer who had seen more disasters than a weatherman in hurricane season. He was skeptical as ever, but if he had doubts, he kept them to himself. "You really think these tin cans will do any damage?" he asked, eyeing the cobbled-together devices they'd assembled. "They're not tin cans, Rayner. They're explosively inclined metal tubes," Miri corrected, her sarcasm not lost even in the face of doom. "If you say so." Rayner shrugged. "At least it'll be a hell of a light show." In the mess hall-turned-war room, Jackson and Ulan laid out the plan. It was simple, in the way that defusing a bomb with a toothpick and a prayer was simple. "We'll plant these charges at key structural points," Jackson explained. "When we set them off, it should create enough of a distraction for Miri to hack into their systems and hit that central node. And if it doesn't," a voice piped up, "then you can say I told you so from the afterlife," Jackson quipped. Across the room, Margot looked at Ulan, her earlier doubts giving way to determination. "You really believe we can do this?" Ulan nodded. "I do. And even if we don't, at least we won't have to answer to any cosmic overlords in the afterlife." The crew shared a collective dark chuckle, a moment of levity in the shadow of impending chaos. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As the team set out to execute their plan, Miri felt a pang of something suspiciously like hope. It was a rare feeling, almost as rare as a day without catastrophe on the last best hope. It felt foreign, like wearing shoes 2 sizes too big. The corridors of the station seemed to close in around them, the walls whispering with the collective anxiety of their inhabitants. The air was thick, not just with the scent of ozone and engine oil, but with the weight of unspoken fears and unvoiced prayers. Jackson led the way, his usual swagger tempered by the gravity of the situation. "All right, folks. Remember, we're not just doing this for ourselves. We're doing this for every sorry soul who ever believed in second chances." Miri shot him a sidelong glance. "You're getting sentimental on me, Jackson." "Not sentimental," he corrected. "Just realistic. If we pull this off, we might just prove that humanity's more than just a cosmic joke. And if we don't, then we'll be the punchline." They reached the first checkpoint, a junction where the station's structural integrity was at its most questionable. Miri and Rayner quickly set to work, placing their makeshift explosives with the precision of bomb-diffusing experts who'd learned on the fly. "All right, Rayner," Miri said, as they finished the setup. "All set." Rayner grunted in acknowledgement, his expression unreadable. "Set and ready, kid. Let's see if we can't show these gods a thing or two about hubris." As they moved to the next location, The station's familiar creaks and groans seemed to echo their resolve. It was as if the structure itself was mustering courage for the coming storm. Jackson and Ulan met them at the final checkpoint, their expressions a mix of determination and trepidation. "Everything ready?" Jackson asked. "We're as ready as we'll ever be," Miri replied. "All right then." Jackson took a deep breath, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability before the storm. "Let's light this candle and give them a show they won't forget." The crew gathered one final time, their collective gaze fixed on the task at hand. Despite the odds, despite the uncertainty, there was a shared understanding that this was their moment. A chance to fight, to reclaim their home, to defy the gods and claim their place among the stars. And so, with one last darkly humorous prayer, they set their plan into motion. The last best hope groaned in protest as the charges detonated, sending a shudder through the station that felt like the universe itself had taken a breath. Alarms wailed, lights flickered, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, it seemed as if the station might tear itself apart. But amidst the chaos, Miri's fingers danced across the control panel, coaxing the station's systems to life with a grace that bordered on the divine. She felt the surge as the central node faltered, its connection severed by her deft touch. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the station's systems began to stabilize, a collective sense of disbelief gave way to cautious celebration. They'd done it. They'd fought back, and against all odds they'd won a small victory. It wasn't much, but in the grand scheme of things it was everything. In the control room, Miri slumped back against the console, her expression a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "Well, that was something," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson grinned, his relief palpable. "Something indeed. I think we just taught those gods a lesson in humility." Ulan chuckled, his earlier doubts dispelled by the success of their plan. "Who knew humans could be so stubborn? Everyone who's ever met one," Jackson replied, his tone light but his gaze serious. As the crew regrouped, their spirits lifted by their unexpected success, they knew that this was only the beginning. The gods were still out there, still a threat. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they had hope. And in the end, maybe that was the most powerful weapon of all. The last best hope was a name that increasingly felt like a cosmic joke, and Miri Solis couldn't help but chuckle darkly at the irony as their little rebellion kicked into gear. They were about to put their faith in a plan that was as much duct taped together as the sorry excuse for a station they called home. But hey, desperate times called for desperate measures, and possibly insane ones too. Jackson Vire strode through the corridors with a swagger that almost masked the anxiety simmering beneath. Almost. "All right, folks, remember, this is our shot to show those wannabe gods that humans don't roll over for anyone. Not even divine squatters." Rayner, the grizzled engineer who looked like he'd seen more action than anyone should in this lifetime, grunted his agreement as he dragged a cart of makeshift explosives down the hall. "If this works, I might actually start believing in miracles," he said, his voice a gravelly testament to decades of bad air and worse coffee. Miri gave him a sideways glance, her fingers dancing over a handheld console almost affectionately. "Let's not get carried away, Rayner. Miracles are for people who haven't met the universe yet." As they reached their first target, a junction point where the station's guts were most vulnerable, Miri took a deep breath. "Okay, kids, let's make some magic." With a mixture of precision and a little bit of prayer to whatever might be listening in this god-forsaken corner of the galaxy, she set the first charge. Jackson checked his wrist communicator, his expression the epitome of forced confidence. "Once these are lit, there's no going back. But it's not like we have much left to lose, right? Except maybe our dignity, and that left the station ages ago," Miri quipped, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. Ulan Vern, their ever-enthusiastic morale booster, chimed in from behind. "Dignity's overrated. I'll take survival any day." They moved on, setting charges at key points throughout the station. Each placement was a calculated risk, a gamble that might just end with them being sucked into the vacuum of space. But then again, living on the last best hope was already a gamble with dismal odds. As the team reached the final checkpoint, tension wrapped around them so tight it felt like a second skin. Miri glanced at Jackson, whose bravado was starting to show cracks. "You ready for this?" "Ready as I'll ever be," Jackson replied, his voice steady even as his hands trembled slightly. Raynor checked the final setup, his demeanor all business. "This better work, Solis. I'm too old to die in a ball of fire," Miri smirked. "Don't worry, Raynor. If it all goes to hell, you'll be so vaporized you won't even know it." With all the charges set, the team retreated to the control room, where Miri would perform her digital dance of defiance. The plan was simple on paper: detonate the charges, distract the gods, sever their connection, and hope the universe was feeling generous. As the countdown began, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margot, who'd been swaying between loyalty and defection, looked more committed than ever. "I hope this works," she muttered, as much to herself as anyone. "It'll work," Ulan declared, more for his benefit than hers. Miri took her place at the console, fingers poised over the controls. "All right, everyone, hold on to your butts. Things are about to get interesting." The charges went off in a carefully orchestrated sequence, sending tremors through the station that rattled the loose bolts in Miri's teeth. Alarms wailed, lights flickered, and for a moment it felt like the end of everything. But amidst the chaos, Miri's fingers found their rhythm. She worked her magic on the analog systems, finding the backdoor in the celestial squatter's tech. Her fingers danced like a pianist on a dark stage, each key press a note in a symphony of defiance. "Come on, you stubborn piece of junk," Miri muttered, coaxing the station's outdated systems to do what they weren't designed to. She felt the resistance, the pushback from forces beyond comprehension, but she pushed harder. Jackson watched, his heart in his throat, as Miri finally slammed the final command home. The central node, a linchpin in the alien tech, shuddered, its connection flickering like a dying star. And just like that, the tide turned. The station stabilized, the oppressive presence of the gods receding like a bad memory. In the aftermath, the last best hope systems hummed with a defiant vitality, a testament to the stubbornness of its human crew. The control room erupted in cheers and disbelieving laughter, the kind that bubbles up when you've just cheated death and don't quite believe it yourself. Miri slumped back in her chair, exhaustion and triumph warring on her features. "Well, that was suitably dramatic," Jackson said, a wide grin splitting his face. Miri shook her head, a weary smile on her lips. "Told you it was risky. But hey, we pulled it off." "Maybe we're not as doomed as we thought," Raynor chuckled, his grizzled face softening in rare amusement. "Guess those gods just met their match." Ulan punched the air, his earlier foe confidence now real. "We did it. We actually did it," the crew gathered, their spirits buoyed by the unexpected victory. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope flickered among them, a fragile thing but real. As the celebrations continued, Miri allowed herself a moment of reflection. They'd faced down gods and won, using nothing more than human ingenuity and a little bit of madness. It didn't change the fact that the universe was still a harsh, unforgiving place, but it did remind them that they had a fighting chance. "Think they'll come back?" Margot asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Jackson shrugged, his swagger returning now that the crisis had passed. "If they do, we'll be ready. After all, we just proved that humans aren't pushovers." Raynor nodded, his skepticism giving way to a rare moment of optimism. "And if they want a rematch, we'll give them one they won't forget." The crew laughed, a dark, victorious sound that echoed through the corridors of the last best hope. It wasn't much, this victory over gods, but it was theirs. And in the vast, indifferent expanse of space, that was no small thing. Miri stood, stretching the tension from her muscles, knowing that this wasn't the end. The gods might retreat, but they'd never truly disappear. But for now, in this moment, they'd won their freedom. She glanced at Jackson, who met her gaze with a nod of understanding. "What's next?" he asked, the fire of rebellion still burning in his eyes. Next, Miri replied, a sly grin spreading across her face. Next we figure out how to fix the damn waste recyclers, because I'm not ending my days knee-deep in cosmic compost. Jackson chuckled, the sound filtering through the lingering tension. Sounds like a plan. Let's keep this momentum going. As they set about the next task, the crew of the Last Best Hope carried with them the knowledge that they'd defied the odds, face down gods, and come out the other side. In space, optimism might be rare, but every now and then, humanity had a way of pulling off the impossible. And if that wasn't a reason to keep fighting, Miri didn't know what was. The universe might not care, but they'd remind it that humans were here to stay. The Last Best Hope, now mercifully stable, hummed with the kind of quiet that felt like a collective exhale from every soul aboard. You could almost hear the station sighing in relief, if you didn't count the creaking metal that made a disgruntled noise or two. It was the sound of survival, and somehow they'd pulled it off. Just another normal day in their cosmic cul-de-sac. Jackson Vire leaned against the bulkhead, watching as Miri Solis and the rest of the ragtag crew sorted through the chaotic aftermath. The grimy mess hall, flickering lights and all, seemed to pulsate with a newfound energy. Or maybe that was just the caffeine kicking in. Either way, it was as close to a victory lap as they were going to get. Feels almost peaceful now, doesn't it? Miri muttered, joining Jackson, her eyes scanning the room like she was looking for a reason to be cynical. Old habits die hard. Yeah, Jackson replied, grinning. If you ignore the fact that we're one wrong turn from a vacuum-wide death, it's downright cozy. Miri chuckled, shaking her head. If we ever do get out of this alive, we should market the place as a retreat. Escape the gods, enjoy the ambience of existential dread. Jackson snorted, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. I'd pay for that. Might even throw in a free therapy session. In the corner, Ulan Verne was giving an impromptu pep talk to a group of refugees who looked like they'd seen better days. He had his hands spread wide like a preacher at a sermon, full of enthusiasm that bordered on delusional. But hey, sometimes delusion was contagious. Listen up, everyone, Ulan declared, his voice carrying over the hum of activity. Today, we showed those celestial squatters that humans don't just survive, we thrive. We're like cosmic cockroaches, persistent, annoying, and impossible to kill. A few people laughed, more out of exhaustion than amusement, but it was something. In a place like this, you took your victories where you could find them, even if it involved being compared to vermin. Rayner, still covered in soot from his own personal battle with the station's cantankerous engines, ambled over with the air of someone who'd just been through the ringer and was somehow better for it. Cockroaches, huh? Does that make me the exterminator or the exterminated? Maybe both, Jackson quipped. Dual roles, good for the resume. Rayner grinned, a rarity that made him look 10 years younger and 100 times less grizzled. Guess we're all wearing multiple hats these days. Anyone seen a hat from Miraculous Engineers? I'd like to try it on. Margot, one of the more recent recruits who'd flirted with betrayal before ultimately choosing camaraderie over cowardice, sidled up with a wry smile. I'll sew you one, Rayner. Can't promise it won't be as patchwork as our plans, though. Ulan clapped his hands together, drawing attention back to his makeshift sermon. We're not just surviving, we're building something. We're showing the universe what it means to be human. Miri raised an eyebrow. What? Stubborn and slightly masochistic exactly. Ulan shot back undeterred. We're not just defying gods, we're reinventing ourselves. We've got the determination of a drunk looking for his next pint, and we're not stopping. Uplifting, Miri said, deadpan. Someone call an inspirational poster company. Jackson, buoyed by the banter and the knowledge that they'd lived to quip another day, felt a rare sense of contentment. Brief, fleeting, but undeniably there. We're not out of the woods yet, but we've got a machete, and that's something. More like a rusty pocket knife, Rayner interjected, his grin turning wry. But I'll take it. As the crew dispersed to continue the work of rebuilding, there was a palpable shift in the air. Something akin to optimism, though not quite ready to be labeled as such. More like a cautious hope, peeking out from behind the curtain like an understudy waiting for their big break. "There's a lot to do," Jackson said, turning to Miri. "But for the first time, it feels like we might actually be getting somewhere." Miri nodded, her expression softening. "Yeah. We've patched up the station, sent those gods packing, temporarily at least, and now we've got to figure out the next steps." Jackson tilted his head, considering. "And give those waste recyclers the ass-kicking of their lives." "Never thought I'd be so excited about plumbing. Small victories," Miri replied with a smirk. "We've got to savor them." "Take that, cosmic compost." Their conversation was interrupted by Ulan, who bounded over with the energy of someone who didn't know how to stay still. "Captain Miri, I've got a crazy idea, just one." Jackson asked, feigning surprise. "Must be a slow day." Ulan grinned, unperturbed. "What if we rewire the old analog systems to boost our power grid? We might even make the lights stop flickering." "Could be the stuff of legends. Legends about not tripping over our own feet." Miri quipped, but there was interest in her eyes. "I like it. Let's get started." As they huddled over the plans, drawn on the back of whatever scraps they could find, there was a sense of forward momentum. A recognition that while they were still up to their necks in cosmic crap, they were making headway. Incremental, frustrating headway, but headway nonetheless. "Think the gods'll come back?" Margot asked, looking up from a tangle of wires with a question that had been on everyone's mind since the beginning of their little rebellion. "They might," Jackson replied, his voice steady, "but we'll be better prepared. We've got a station full of people who've faced down the void and come out swinging. And if they do come back," Ulan added, his voice thick with determination, "we'll give them the fight of their lives." Humanity didn't crawl out of the primordial ooze to be pushed around by a bunch of cosmic interlopers. "Well, I feel better already," Miri said, rolling her eyes but unable to hide her smile. "Let's just hope they're not too keen on that rematch." As the crew worked, the station felt more alive than it had in years. The last best hope might have been a ramshackle collection of metal and dreams, but it was theirs. And in the vast, indifferent cosmos that made all the difference. Later, as the artificial night fell over the station, Jackson found himself alone in the control room, staring out into the void. There was something oddly comforting about it, the reminder that they were just one small blip in an infinite universe. Insignificant in the grand scheme, yet significant to each other. Miri joined him, her presence a comforting anchor. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, leaning against the console next to him. "Just thinking about how far we've come," Jackson replied. "And how far we've yet to go." Miri nodded, her gaze following his out into the stars. "We've got a long road ahead, but at least we're not alone." "No, we're not," Jackson agreed, a small smile playing on his lips. "And that makes all the difference." They stood in companionable silence, the weight of their shared experiences settling comfortably between them like an old, familiar coat. The universe might be vast and uncaring, but here, in this little pocket of defiance and camaraderie, they'd carved out a place for themselves. "What do you think the history books will say about us?" Miri asked, her tone light but her eyes serious. Jackson shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "Probably something like, they were stubborn as hell and they didn't know when to quit." "Sounds about right," Miri replied with a chuckle. "But at least we'll go down swinging." The quiet stretched out, punctuated only by the soft hum of the station's machinery. It was a rare moment of peace, hard-earned and deeply appreciated. "Ready to tackle those recyclers tomorrow?" Jackson asked, breaking the silence with the mundane reality of their situation. "I'm ready," Miri replied, determination in her voice. "We've got a station to fix and a future to build." Jackson nodded, a sense of optimism, real, honest optimism taking root. "Then let's get to it." They turned away from the window, back to the messy reality of their lives aboard the last best hope. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As they left the control room, the station continued its quiet vigil against the backdrop of stars. a testament not to the gods, but to the indomitable spirit of those who dared to defy them.